Where did our universe come from, and our earth within it? Our earth, a place of infinite beauty, and in perfect balance with the greater cosmos. But also, where did we come from? How did we get here? And why are we here? And is there life after death? These are questions, and many more, that for millennia the great philosophers have sought the answers. None have yet come up with one to satisfy all. The age-old debate between the theories of creation and evolution have been raging for decades, even since before 1859, when Darwin published his book called On the Origin of Species. The idea that all life forms had transformed from those less complex was not new, but with the release of his research that year, Darwin caused a huge feather-ruffling shitstorm within science itself and the church. To this day, neither creation or evolution has emerged as a clear proven answer to those equally age-old questions of how life began or continued on Earth, though the more easily accepted logic of the theory of evolution is favoured by many. Depending on which camp you sit, you may believe there is actually no debate, or indeed any need for one. Certainly though, it seems that most evolutionists regard their theory as clear-cut, true, and proven beyond all reasonable doubt, more so than Christians, most of whom realise that it isn't so clear-cut aside from their own personal experience. Further, most evolutionists are atheists who also hold to the finality of life upon death. But on the other hand, many, Christians or not, believe that surely there must be has to be more to life possibility when considering the mind-boggling complexities of the universe, and the seemingly endless but short time afforded us on Earth with all its associated conundrums. For these believers of an afterlife, it just does not seem right if there is no point to our existence. God or no God, intelligent design, creation, or evolution, either way, Christians have always struggled with the idea that the complexities of our world, or indeed ourselves, developed entirely through the process of evolution by natural selection, this being the transitional progression of life forms that has apparently occurred perhaps as if by accident or fluke. Even Richard Dawkins, the most impassioned supporter of evolution, once said,
"Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose."
Of course, he vehemently disagrees with the mechanics of his own statement with the words, "give the appearance," despite his unmistakably accurate observation. The intricacies of DNA alone, with its millions of encoded instructions that create a human or even a simple cell, is staggering. An easy analogy would be a stack of fully scripted A4 pages, 300 feet tall, which is equal to the amount of information that is stored in the DNA inside every human cell, of which there are 37.2 trillion. It is said that 1 teaspoon full of DNA contains more information than all of the literature ever written in human history. The resulting life forms from the organized combination of this mind-boggling biological matrix is not only mathematically impossible for the chance of evolution, but it just simply could not happen. Similarly, consider also the perfect placement of all the stars and planets, including our Sun, each needing to be perfectly positioned and aligned to enable an equilibrium so finely balanced should one planet or moon slip, or the Sun just cool a little, or any other change in the many essential parameters that keep our Earth habitable, that such change could cause absolute mayhem, if not eventual total destruction. Equally, aside from all the cosmological concurrences and fine-tuning, to suggest that we have no soul, or that mind is brain, is to basically assert, in a sense, that our existence is completely pointless and meaningless, that we are spiritless minders of a minuscule patch of time and space waiting to die, and that is it. Francis Crick, who together with James Watson discovered DNA in 1953, once said that we are nothing but a pack of neurons. But to many this statement could not be further from the truth. There are many arguments and theories on both sides, and many that are credible, but it is certain that an individual's personal bent or upbringing is a deciding factor in belief. However, no matter what the propaganda, either way, most seemingly prudent folk will never be swayed because of the beliefs indoctrinated to them as children. To that end, if God could be persuaded to perform a whole bunch of tricks, healing the sick, making the deformed whole again, even creating a nano-universe before the eyes of the world, there would still be the detractors, simply because, in most cases, the mind justifies what the heart desires. This film will clearly show that on the balance of probabilities, it is more likely to the prudent man that the theory of evolution is less likely and falls short to explain life in the universe. However, if one can get one's head around a little magical hocus pocus on a grand scale, then creation is a complete answer to the origins of life and all, notwithstanding giving rise to a whole host more questions that don't necessarily need answers to satisfy the first. These are the questions which both evolutionists and creationists alike are still grappling with today, and this film will try and throw some light on the strengths and weaknesses of both arguments. Throughout this film, the devil's advocate has been employed in favour of dealing with the best and most obvious facts that one might present to a skeptic, no matter which camp he or she sits. However, some Christian viewers may think the answers to some issues raised are self-explanatory, but some conclusions reached don't coincide with religion. The facts cannot be denied. The same is true for evolution. Lastly, as Christianity is the dominant religion in New Zealand, it is used as a reference to counter arguments, but not to promote it as being correct over any other. In this film, any reference to religion is as an all-encompassing term that will embrace all religions worldwide, and which see them as equals inasmuch as the morals they teach is common to all. The scientific revolution is said to have started with Nicholas Copernicus in the 16th century, who asserted a sun-centered cosmos, and ending with Isaac Newton in the 18th century with his laws of motion. But Darwin, who contributed just as much and really bedlamized scientific and societal thinking by taking God out of it completely. Darwin's theory not only changed ideas about the origin of species, but also had a huge effect socially. It took the giant leap from the Renaissance thinking that not just challenged religion, but flew in its face, and caused absolute upheaval between the church and science, which at the time was steeped in religious ideology. Unlike creation, evolution does, however, fit the slanted criteria of the scientific method, in that it can be observed, tested and measured, and conforms to the rigours of scientific scrutiny, despite embracing some unproven, compelling ideas. There are a number of other supporting theories that attempt to explain the origin of life, from which Darwin's theory then proceeds to populate the world with creatures weird and wonderful, including us. Charles Darwin, despite a long-held belief by Christianity, was not evil. He was born into a wealthy family and was a very nice man, who would later become very honest and self-critical of his own theory. From a very early age he was actually destined for the church to become a vicar, but as a young man he was seen by his tutors as a wastrel and idle, a view also shared by his father. Eventually he managed to convince his father that if he joined an expedition he'd settle down on his return and continue his clerical studies. In 1835 he joined the HMS Beagle, a British survey ship on a 5-year journey which visited South America, the Galapagos, New Zealand, Australia, and the Cocos and Keeling Islands. Throughout this journey, Darwin observed and made many discoveries that challenged his Christian beliefs that had been drummed into him since birth, and which forced him to abandon the idea that God had created all species. This realization did not sit well with him. In fact, he wrote that it was like confessing to murder. But the evidence could not be ignored. The next problem was While evolution was not a new idea, its concepts did not fit the accepted viewpoint held by the scientific elite that all things were created by God, and to see it any other way was no less than complete heresy. On his return to England, all thoughts of joining the clergy were far from his mind, and he desired to be part of that scientific elite that presided over all science. In Victorian England at the time, every aspect of society was dominated by the church, including the leading naturalists, who were often also clergy too. Darwin played along with the ideas held by them, while in secret fastidiously advancing his own theory, which he knew would be rejected vehemently and result with his exile and ridicule if he went public. For the next 20 years, Darwin recorded his ideas, too fearful to publish. In 1858, Darwin received a letter from another naturalist, Alfred Wallace, who had also been thinking about evolution and seeking Darwin's opinion on the concept. In the letter, Wallace described ideas which practically mirrored Darwin's. This finally prompted Darwin to release his book, causing huge controversy in 1859. A week-long meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science was convened at Oxford University, and with the support of 2 other recognised naturalists, he took the case of evolution to the establishment. But to the hierarchy of English science at the time, the idea that man had descended from monkeys, as they saw it, did not sit well, and of course anyone else who may have shared similar private convictions were too fearful of ostracism to speak up in support, and naturally his theory started a fierce debate that has been raging since. Darwin's theory, explained in his book On the Origin of Species, describes the gradual evolution of species, but not the origin of life or the universe. In it, Darwin theorizes that species undergo physical modifications over a period of time through the process of natural selection, and that beneficial characteristics are preferentially passed on to future generations, while the more adapted survive because of those beneficial gains, such as better camouflage, sharper teeth, or bigger brains, etc. As the fittest, as in best fit, reproduce, they pass on those evolutionary gains, with each modification resulting in more superior life forms, that which over an exceedingly long period of time cause eventual transformations, such as that of ape-like animals to men, as they are today, be they apes or not. To prove this, Darwin cited among many other things 13 different variations of finch, coming from 13 different islands in the Galapagos archipelago. He believed that while the islands were far enough apart to prevent further interbreeding, that they must have originally come from a single breeding pair, perhaps blown off course from the mainland of South America, whose offspring then populated the surrounding islands. These finches then adapted or evolved to suit the conditions and food supplies on that island, most notably in the beak and body size. So too the giant tortoises had different shaped shells and neck lengths as they adapted to suit the differing feeding habits needed on each island. But despite his years of exhaustive research, Darwin misinterpreted what he saw and simply got it wrong. This illustration shows Darwin's famous finches, which really can only represent adaptive change. They are basically the same animal as each other and not that different from what they started from. Without doubt, even if the birds with the most radical differences were returned from whence they came, the home of their ancestors, they would eventually and quite quickly change back to how they were. This bird was never going to turn into an eagle or anything too far from what it originally was. The central theme of Darwin's theory simply proposes that all life forms of today have gradually evolved from those less complex over millions of years. This would logically mean there should be a myriad of strong interlinking paleontological evidence throughout the world of that evolution and of many species, but there simply isn't. Darwin himself, in contemplation, asked, when referring to the fossil record, why, If species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? But as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? When Darwin asked this, he firmly believed that future explorations would find such evidence. To him it was only a matter of time. However, today many scientists have expressed skepticism over the fossil record. Evolutionary paleontologists claim that the bones are screaming with such transitional evidence from all corners, but any real link between these finds, other than the fact that they look similar, has not been proven to exist, and that is one big reason why the theory of evolution still remains a theory. So the questions have to be asked: where are the missing links, and why didn't some of those transitional animals survive also? To satisfy the evolutionary premise of the gradual and continual transition of species, there must have been thousands of different transmutational ape humans alive over a long period of time. So why didn't any of them or their fossil remains survive? Also, surely some of them must have stayed in their unchanging environment into which they were born, and therefore had no need for change. There must have been millions of different forms, but there is no conclusive ancestral chain that one could hang one's hat on. Yet in stark contrast, a good many soft-bodied organisms such as those in the Burgess Shale found in the Canadian Rockies have been dated apparently some 500 million years older than Homo erectus. So how did these less robust organisms survive in fossil form and not the numerous different transitional fossil forms of our ancestors? There should have been numerous intermediary species linking one to another, with incomplete half-developed limbs, and to that end, why aren't there any ape-like humans, some of our ancestors, still running around today, yet we don't find even the smallest fossil fragments of them? This can only mean the fossils that they have found are only the ancestors of present-day apes, or are just other species of apes that simply became extinct, just like the dinosaurs did. Despite its conservative political correctness, Wikipedia has this to say about the fossil record. Transitional fossils serve as a reminder that taxonomic divisions are human constructs that have been imposed in hindsight on the continuum of variation. Because of the incompleteness of the fossil record, there is usually no way to know exactly how close a transitional fossil is to the point of divergence. Therefore, it cannot be assumed that transitional fossils are direct ancestors or more recent groups, though they are frequently used as models for such ancestors. The esoteric world of paleontological evolutionary science can be difficult for a layman to decipher at times, and in fact both sides of the argument sound completely credible, which is also true of many debate videos which can be found on YouTube. This link to one such debate between leading scientists from both sides is typical. However, the general ballgame seems to be that no sooner does one side come up with good evidence or a plausible theory than the other will put up a counter-argument in an attempt to discredit it. And so it goes. One of the apparent rare missing links which evolutionists claim to be strong evidence that would explain and prove the transitional path from ape to man is Australopithecus, or indeed one specimen more commonly known as Lucy. But this reconstruction, which is exceedingly dodgy, employs far-reaching speculative license. From the few bones found, they somehow managed to get this, and then this. The lighter coloured parts are the real bones. The rest is speculation based on the shape and symmetry of those real bones. But it is uncertain how they managed to work out the arrangement of the feet, as there were no bones to go by. How could those responsible for this reconstruction have possibly known that this animal had human-like feet? Australopithecus lucy is being displayed as an accurate and factual recreation of an early human ancestor, and can only be described as deceptive wishful thinking by its creators. Lucy could only have ever been an ape and probably not even bipedal. This link explains many other mischievous factors that would suggest that this is nothing but a reconstruction made up to fit the apparent preconceived ideas of human evolution. Piltdown Man was another supposed missing transitional link displayed in the Museum of Natural History in England, and for many years their administration would not allow any examination of the bones. But once they did, it was soon discovered that the lower jawbone was that of an orangutan, which had been stained with tea to give it the appearance of being old. This charade was put forward by Charles Dawson, an amateur archaeologist in 1912, simply so he could gain notoriety, and his hoax remained influential in British archaeology and indeed around the world until it was exposed in 1953. The complete transitional fossil record for the evolution of the whale is regarded by evolutionists as the best example of evolution that would apparently add strong weight to their theory. They claim the whale has evolved from a land-based quadruped to a fully aquatic mammal over a period of about 9 million years. Some advocates suggest even less. However, just like many of the claims they have made, this too is highly postulative and supported with many deceptive reconstructions in just about all stages. Pakicetus was apparently the first in the line of Setia evolution. It is, however, unclear how paleontological scientists decided that these walking animals were whales. An incomplete skull was first discovered in 1983, and because of some subtle similarities and attributes in the air bones and teeth, it was thus decided that this was the remains of the first walking whale. Astonishingly, even though a good portion of the end of the top jaw was not recovered, some paleontologists even decided that the nose aperture was positioned further up the skull on the bridge to resemble a blowhole rather than at the tip of the nose, where it was more likely to have been for this dog-like animal and essential for sniffing out food, etc. The presumption that the animal was a whale is a long bow, and those subtle factors that led to this conclusion are also present in other land-based animals as well anyway. Later full skeletal remains were discovered, giving a more complete picture of how the animal may have looked, also showing the blowhole at the tip of the nose. These revelations obviously don't sit well with the entire whale hypothesis, and most disturbingly, Pakicetus was for many years and until recently still being displayed with the original incorrect reconstructions at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the National History Museum in London. Ambulocetus, ancestor of Pakicetus, is touted as the link between the terrestrial land-based animal to the fully swimming whale, and is referred to as the walking whale, but more amphibious. It is shown in many different ancestral charts as having rear fin-like legs with webbed front feet, and is depicted as swimming, when in fact the actual skeleton fossil has strong powerful rear legs for movement on land. There is no evidence that this animal came anywhere near water other than to drink. It is also claimed that Rhodocetus, which is about midway in the evolutionary chart, had 4 legs, which were flipper-like, and a tail fluke, but fossil tail bones had never been found. When Dr. Philip Gingerich, the paleontologist who discovered Rhodocetus and was responsible for the reconstruction, was asked how he knew the so-called whale had a tail fluke, he said,
"Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke."
Of course, speculation is fine. It is needed to create a hypothesis and should be revealed as such. But once it is disproved, it should be discarded along with the reconstructions, or it just then becomes a lie. And so the deception goes throughout the fairy tale of whale evolution. This link to an article by Harun Yahya, A Whale Fantasy from National Geographic, gives a more detailed explanation. This book, called Forbidden Archaeology by Michael Cremo, details the numerous human artifacts, skeletons and footprints etc. that have been discovered and dated much older than the mainstream acceptance for human arrival in the Earth's history, which is about 100 to 200,000 years ago, depending on which expert holds the microphone. This anatomically correct human skull was found in Buenos Aires in the early 1900s, beneath a thick layer of limestone rock dated at 1.5 million years old. This anatomically modern human jaw was found in Vauxhall, England, and dated at 2 million years old. The reason why these fossil finds are hidden is that, apart from throwing into doubt the present structure of the evolutionary theory, is that it makes ardent scholars of mainstream archaeology look like complete idiots who have been chasing their own tails for years and who would be all out of a job should the validity of these finds be given any credence. There are thousands of other finds like these hidden in the back rooms of museums all over the world, not on display because they all tell a truth that scientists don't want to hear. It means that Homo sapien did not evolve from Homo erectus, because Homo erectus was in existence at the same time, which also means that this is yet another piece of evidence that sits atop the growing mountain that would cast a huge shadow of doubt over the theory of evolution. There is no doubt that Darwin and his successors have conclusively proven that evolution did play a part in the development of our world today, but it was only an evolutionary change within species that did not improve the species but varied it to suit the habitat, such as the different breeds of dogs for example, and even similar differing features between the skulls in the fossil record can be found in the different races of modern humans that exist today. The Cambrian explosion. This is a significant period in the Earth's history, and no matter what camp you reside, it is one which perhaps evolutionists would probably prefer not to have to explain. This is a period of time occurring about 500 million years ago, lasting for 10 to 50 million years, a comparatively short time geologically and biologically speaking. During this period, there was a sudden, abundant and diverse appearance of life which cannot be explained in evolutionary terms, as there has been no evidence of precursor life forms found from the pre-Cambrian era known as the Ediacaran period. The Cambrian period is also named after Cambria, the Roman name for Wales, where the first studies of rocks were made, giving rise to the science. The emergence and diversity of life that burst into existence during this period accounted for all the major phyla or body plans that exist for life today, if one holds to the theory that these animals were at the beginning of our own evolution. These animals include chordates, animals with a dorsal nerve cord, hard-bodied brachiopods, which resemble clams, and arthropods, ancestors of spiders, insects and crustaceans. Some scientists believe that small changes in oxygen levels in the oceans gave rise to the sudden explosion of life, and given that the Earth's environment is constantly changing, this could be entirely possible. But whether or not it could cause the sudden explosion of life is certainly debatable. Others say that the emergence of vision, which created predators, could also have been the spark that ramped up natural selection, and then of course there are the supernatural explanations, all of which are inconclusive. Random mutations, an evolutionist's saviour or headache. In the minds of many, the theory of evolution is settled, and there is no question that this process was the trigger for the origin of life on Earth, though just as many are sceptical. But while Darwin's theory is hotly debated, the process of natural selection is accepted by all. However, it must be noted that natural selection is a culling mechanism and cannot add new information to the gene pool. The process of natural selection, or survival of the fittest, is fundamentally essential to the theory of evolution to ensure that favourable traits are passed on. But in reality, natural selection can only be part of the more essential natural breeding cycle that helps to ensure the survival of a species by eliminating the weak, the sick and the deformed, which is only part of the circle of life and has no evolutionary power. This from Mark Champagnes, creator of the video Evolution Demolition. Natural selection is a culling mechanism that filters, culls and kills. It's real to be sure, and it has function in populations, but not to preserve favoured races as Darwin thought. Natural selection does not create viable information, but rather destroys non-viable information. From 1856 to 1863, through experiments carried out with the pea plant, Gregor Mendel was able to show that variations in generations occurred through a combination of genes from both parents and not natural selection. At the time, his work was largely ignored as it did not support evolution. However, sometime later, once his work was reconsidered, most biologists, while believing that evolution was a fact, began to reject that natural selection was the mechanism, because without new information, there was nothing for natural selection to select. It also does not explain meiosis, cell division which gives rise to the sex cells, and without it there is no sexual reproduction, which cannot evolve anyway without natural selection. In other words, natural selection requires a reproductive system to function because preferred variations are passed on to the next generation and needs a reproductive system to do so. So it has to be asked, how did the first reproductive system evolve since natural selection could not have been in existence yet? By the early 20th century, Darwin's theory was revived by combining natural selection with Mendel's genetics and through the introduction of random mutations, which would add new information to the genome. This new interpretation was coined as Neo-Darwinism, which is now the universally and uncritically accepted version of evolution. But aside from the fact that it has never been proven that mutations have increased the information in the genome, because mutations cause damage, it would be mathematically impossible, as mutations, and in particular beneficial mutations, are rare and occur at such a slow rate, it would be impossible for anything to evolve in the timelines which now constitute the accepted structure of evolution. Evolutionists rely on the chance that a mutation, when it occurs at random, will be beneficial, which would therefore add new information to the genome. These beneficial mutations, of course, would have to happen quite frequently to account for all the information that is now, for example, in our own DNA. Also, once this beneficial mutation has occurred and has been passed on, then the same small but beneficial continuation of the same mutation has to occur in the next generation, and so on, till, for example, the paw of Pakicetus turns into a whale fin. The chances of this happening even once is possible, but astronomically impossible a further 2 or 3 times at the start of a process that may require many thousands of beneficial mutations in the same direction just to evolve the whale's fin. Then of course there are all the other mutations required to evolve the tail fluke, the blowhole, the aquatic ear, and every other difference between this land-based dog to a big mammalian fish. In this video, Richard Dawkins is confounded by this very question, and to date neither he or his compatriots have been able to answer it properly.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop while I think?
I'm recording.
Okay. There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to be able to look around the world today and look at our ancestors. We ought to be able to see the intermediates between fish and reptiles, and between reptiles and...
There is much debate over this question, and in fact evolutionists and atheists claim that bacterial antibiotic resistance and the resistance of rats and flies to poisons, etc., point to this as evidence. But in every case, the mutation is actually a degradation of the genome, devolution if you will, which is the reason why the organism has become resistant. For example, Amaranthus hybridus, or pigweed, is a plant regarded by most as a weed, which grows widely throughout North America. To combat its invasive destructiveness on crops, the herbicide atrazine was developed specifically targeted at the pigweed and worked by preventing photosynthesis, which in turn caused the plant to die. Somehow this plant developed a mutation in its protein makeup that gave it resistance to the herbicide, and has been touted by evolutionists as evolution in action. But it can be argued that no information has actually been introduced to the genome of this organism, especially when considered that this resistant variant would have been eliminated by natural selection in the atrazine-free environment. This would mean that the mutation is not so beneficial outside that environment and is in fact slightly negative, or at the very best neutral, because if the atrazine was removed from the environment in time, the resistant strain would again be weeded out by natural selection. It is clear that in most cases mutations destroy life. In medical circles, mutations are universally regarded as deleterious. They are the fundamental cause of aging, cancer and infectious diseases. In some cases, mutations can be beneficial, but are the result of a decrease in the genome. Further, there is a well-supported school of thought among the scientific community that these pseudo-beneficial mutations, because of their deleterious nature, are actually causing a degradation in the human genome, and that we are in fact gradually de-evolving, not evolving. Leading geneticist John Sanford has studied the literature from many of the leading human and population geneticists, and has noted that almost all of them agree that the human genome is degenerating. However, none of them have announced their findings publicly or to the scientific community for fear of backlash. It's a trade secret because it is lethal to neo-Darwinism.
See, everyone understands in genetics that almost all mutations are bad. A lot of them are nearly neutral, but essentially none of them should be absolutely neutral. And to be beneficial, it's like a typographical error in a textbook. It could be beneficial, but it's not likely. It's unlikely with the extremely strong certainty. One of the things, as I looked at the literature and what other people were saying in the field, is I found that basically all human geneticists acknowledge that we are degenerating at present. And some of them think that we're degenerating very rapidly. And so I started reading the population genetics literature more carefully, and I realized that all the leading population geneticists understood this problem and had at some place or another in their writings mentioned it, but never announced it to the world or announced it even to the scientific community. It's kind of one of those just little trade secrets that population geneticists know. And the reason it's a trade secret is because it's lethal to neo-Darwinian theory. It's lethal to the evolutionary point of view. And so, for example, I ran across a paper called "Why Aren't We Dead 100 Times Over?" written by a leading population geneticist who is acknowledging that mutations are happening too fast and that we can't select them away as fast as they accumulate, and that in evolutionary time we should be dead 100, the way he expressed it was, we should be dead 100 times over. And so there's numerous, I started to see more and more papers like that where I could see that population geneticists understood the problem and didn't have good answers, but weren't advertising the problem. It was like, you know, it's a fascinating issue, isn't it? Most people would be really interested to know. but it was, like I said, I believe a trade secret.
Clearly, the evidence that would prove evolution is a strong theory is insufficient. There is as much probability that humans always did walk upright, and that we always did have big brains, and that we appeared on this earth pretty much the same way as the apes did, as they are now. If evolution has played a part in human development, it has only been in minor ways. Perhaps once we did predominantly have slightly sloping foreheads, or a protruding nose and mouth, or even more body hair. One might suggest we lost the body hair because we have been wearing better clothing for centuries and now have better ways to keep warm. But there would be no reason for the loss of hair to happen based on natural selection. A primate would not die because of excessive body hair. If that primate was a human, then he would simply have taken his shirt off or gone for a swim. The extra hair would have made no difference to his survival. Also, any amount of hair that any of the reconstructed ape-human skeletons had on them, as depicted by evolutionists, is purely speculation and of no consequence. It just looks good in the evolutionary propaganda to embellish the illusion and plausibility of the hypothetical transitional path of human development from apishness to us as we are now. So in the beginning there were two main theories, creation and evolution. Both begin the same way, in that the first beginnings of life and the universe as we know it are said to have come from nothing. God said, "Let there be light," and there was, and he saw that it was good. So God commanded by voice that there would be light, which on the face of it is as impossible as a single-celled amoeba evolving to a fish and somehow eventually walking out of the murky, bubbling primordial swamp and morphing into a fully erect Homo sapien. No matter how many years they say it took, it does not seem plausible to many, and just as impossible as commanding light by voice. But for either theory, an abandonment of institutional dogma by the open-minded advocates may be required in order to find some answers. During the research for this film, an absolute denial by evolutionists has emerged, in that their theory is only a theory. To them and all the scientific researchers it is fact, and supported by the following definition from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. The theory of evolution is supported by so many observations and confirming experiments that scientists are confident that the basic components of the theory will not be overturned by new evidence. In science, a theory is not a guess, not a hunch. It is a well-substantiated, well-supported, well-documented explanation for the observations, and is the best explanation. Or at least that is what they would have you believe. Those learned scholars have the microphone, and we are expected to trust what they say. But of course, this is wrong. No scientific theory is true or can be proven absolutely. It can only be strengthened or disproved. It is also an oddity why scientists allow themselves to have a different definition of the word theory. The Oxford Dictionary defines, in part, theory as the sphere of abstract knowledge or speculative thought, which sounds pretty much like a guess and is almost opposite to the scientific definition. Perhaps the reason scientists arrogantly ignore literary scholars is so their guesses can be more right. After all, no scientist likes to be wrong or to be proven wrong. In short, the following 9 problems for the theory seem to be ignored by evolutionary scientists. 1. Just because fossils look similar does not mean that they have to be related. To infer ancestry as fact from very old fragments of bones is an imaginary license in the highest degree of optimism. As a theory it is fine, until proven otherwise, because they could actually be related. 2. Paleontologists often misrepresent fossil finds. 3. Fossil finds and other genuine evidence that don't agree with the accepted structure of evolution are suppressed and disregarded, and the finders often suffer huge public discrimination, which subsequently can be fatal to their careers. 4. There is no strong evidence to explain, in evolutionary terms, the Cambrian explosion. 5. Evolutionary hypotheses are often put forward as fact when clearly they are only compelling ideas, such as reconstruction models or artists' impressions of prehistoric animals. 6. The law of biogenesis states that only life can produce life. Living organisms cannot evolve from non-living matter. 7. Symbiosis. Two living things that depend on each other to survive. Example, bees and flowers must have somehow magically and randomly evolved together. 8. Random mutations, a crucial component to the neo-Darwinian theory. Without them the theory fails, but it is a weak argument invented to get around other evolutionary difficulties. There is a serious lack of any real evidence that would show that beneficial mutations add sufficient new information to the genome of any organism in order to allow evolution at the rate required. It's grasping at straws. Lastly, the origin of information, such as DNA, could only have been created by intelligence. Such complexity could not evolve by chance. The odds to create even the simplest organism by this method give rise to probabilities that are astronomical and quite simply improbable, to the point where it becomes impossible. Despite good evidence supporting adaptive change and natural selection, there is no proof that shows the transformation of any organism to another which is even slightly more advanced. There is no denying that evolution, though arguably to what lineal degree, has played a part in the world's biological development, but the entire theory is largely a compelling idea based on some evidence that only proves adaptive change.